said and said the state must permit its own creature to devour it, to consume it. And so, we're still in relatively the early days of the coming giant plutocracy or oligarchy, as Just Nelson puts it. And so we're sounding the alarm bell right now. The presidential, never before has there been a presidential election with this much money being poured into it, and never has there been a presidential election so devoid of substance and drained of actual discussion of the issues that matter to the American people. And so, for me, the alarm and the crisis is a national one. Now, we experience it at the state level too, and I don't know if I've got the time to get into it, but the way that I see it most clearly is the use of outside corporate money in order to control and dominate the state legislatures for the purposes of continuing the gerrymandering of state legislative and congressional districts, which is the linchpin of political power in America today. And so we've got a very tight triangle between a reactionary Supreme Court, which is just making stuff up and pulling it out of the hat, and then state legislatures, which are being controlled by money, and then a Congress, which is a product of the gerrymandering that the state legislatures produce.
Well, thanks, Jamie, and I am glad that you put your constitutional law professor hat on, because as you know, I personally and our organization just loves constitutional law professors. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and would be a whole separate panel, but why has our Supreme Court not recognized the right to vote as a free speech issue? I mean, if that's not a free speech issue, I don't know what is. Isn't that the most important speech of all? So I want to turn to Congressman Leach and remind you, if you recall, that we did a program together when you were head of the NEH, a wonderful program at the White House with some of our ACS law students who came in to watch a part of the Ken Burns documentary on prohibition and on the amendment process to both set up prohibition and get rid of prohibition. A great panel discussion and afterwards, and I'd like to ask you, since we've heard some of your perspective, why an amendment in this case? Why have you come to think that this crisis is such that we actually need to go with that strategy as opposed to something else?
Well, it doesn't necessitate an amendment, but an amendment is the wisest way to go. The court itself can change its judgment. But if it changes its judgment, it means it can change it again. And so an amendment disposes of the issue. And that doesn't mean that everybody in this room should not be working for getting the Supreme Court to change, which I happen to think is quite possible in at least modest ways and possibly totality ways. Now, having said that, you mentioned not the suffrage amendment, but the alcohol amendment. I want you to know that was led by an Iowa woman who founded the WCTU. And that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and I consider her the author of 2 constitutional amendments, because after passing it, we also had to have one to reject it. But having said that, the issue of the Constitution has been raised, and in one sense, this is an issue of constitutional interpretation. In another sense, based on constitutional interpretation, it's an issue of whether you change the Constitution itself. If we think of our founders, without doubt, one aspect of a Constitution that was original was there were property considerations. And the property considerations related to the Constitution accommodated slavery. In fact, we dealt with the issue of 3/5 of a man. Now, I mention this because what Citizens United does is return America to property considerations of a very substantial nature. And I did a little bit of math in the plane out today, and I want to make this one contrast. that I've never thought through exactly like this, but we're going to have over 100 million people vote this year, and probably closer to 150 million, I don't know. But the average individual will have contributed in assisting a candidate or a political party less than $10, because many will have contributed nothing. A corporation might put in $1 million, and many, not many, but more than a few are putting in many more than that. But let us say you take an average citizen who's put in $10, a corporation puts in $1 million. That is a 100,000 to 1 relationship. We had 3/5 of a man in the Constitution. Now we have 100,000 to 1. Because the premise of America is all men are created equal. All men are not equal to a corporation. And Citizens United says a corporation is an individual. But there is no individual relationship. And what it is in the guise of an individual rights First Amendment issue, the Supreme Court of the United States has made a power play. And this is about power, not individual rights. And what the Supreme Court is saying is that corporations shall have dramatic power. And I'm just going to conclude with one other aspect of this, that the founders at the time of the Constitution were big into human nature. That is, they were moral philosophers as well as political activists. And the reason that we have separation of powers is the assumption that you have to constrain power and constrain individuals as well as respect their individual rights. And so we have separation of power, and then we quadruplicated the system because we have the same thing at the state level, the city level, the county level. And it's all related to a concern for human nature. Now, Jamie holds public office today. Only one of the three of us that does. He's a state legislator, may become a national legislator. And I'm just asking each of you as individuals, if Carolyn here were to give him a $1 million contribution to his campaign, and Jim and I have a view about an issue, but we don't have any money, who do you think Jamie's going to listen to first? What does human nature say to you? I mean, is there any possibility he wouldn't listen carefully to Carolyn? And then it isn't that he doesn't listen, that is, she can come and talk to him, Jim and I can come and talk to him, but it's fall listening. That's F-A-U-X. It's nodding. But you go with the money. And then you also go, when you're elected, Jamie, you're going to find decisions that you're going to make, whether to speak out on an issue or not. You're going to think in your mind, well, if I take this position, will I get the support of somebody? If I don't speak out on something that I should speak out on, might it make me not a target of somebody? And all these calculations that go into voting change. And then you read, and when I was a young member of Congress, people would have fundraisers and that sort of thing. But now you read that congressmen spend an hour to 2 hours a day on the telephone raising money. I mean, that's really bizarre. And then you say to yourself, who are they going to listen to? And this is about free speech, but it's also about how you listen. And the listening is very key.
You know, if I just wanted to sort of interject here to just say, I worked on the Hill for a long time, and I think one of the reasons why this is such a critical issue is people don't understand how members of Congress really do spend their day. I have to admire Senator Tester, who I think at one time was the only member of Congress to actually put his schedule up online so that people could see who he was meeting with. But when it's just also in human nature, I think the more time you spend with certain people, the more you want to think they're actually your friends. And if they're your friends, then they are telling you things that are probably true. And if they're true, then you should probably do something about them. It has really nothing to do with the money that you might have gotten at the event where you met your friends. So I think that's just an element of sort of the shaping of the mind of the member, which of course is not going to influence Jamie, because he's going to be perfect when he gets elected. But so talk a little bit about sort of where do we go from here? And because the title of this conference is Together We Win. So what is it that that you, Jamie, and you, Justice Nelson, think gives you hope that we're going to win?
So if I can take a first shot at it, and I've got to just extricate myself from that hypothetical for 1 minute. Just to be clear, when I first got into politics, I've been a professor of constitutional law for 26 years, and when I first ran for the state Senate 10 years ago, I said I was not going to accept any money from corporations, partnerships, artificial entities. Now, they didn't want to give me any money anyway, to be clear, so it wasn't that big a sacrifice. But I do think that at the state level, it's given me the independence to take a strong stand on issues where, as Congressman Leach is saying, other people, may shrink away from it. But I wanted to add something to his analysis, which I think is a profound one. We need to be clear that the Citizens United decision, although it's hailed by its supporters as some kind of great free speech breakthrough, did absolutely nothing to increase the free speech rights of a single individual human being in the United States of America. Now, why is that? It's because everybody had the right already to spend whatever they wanted in politics out of their own pocket. So what did Citizens United do? All it said was that the CEOs of the corporations could remove money from the corporate treasury, write checks in the corporate treasury to put into politics on an unlimited basis. And this is what they declare to be a great free speech breakthrough, basically the pillaging of what Justice Brandeis called other people's money in order to advance, at best, the corporate political interest, which is adverse to the public interest by definition, because they have to be trying to advance the corporate interest, and either it's congruent with it or it's adverse to it, but it's not the public interest entirely, or maybe it's just the individual personal interest of the CEO who wants to become an ambassador or secretary of commerce or whatever it might be. And there are lots of cases like that too. So why do I have hope about this issue? Well, I've got hope about it because the American people are not stupid, and from the very moment Citizens United was handed down, commanding majorities of the American people have rejected the decision. 60, 70, 80%, depending on the poll that you look at. And when you go back and you look at the Bill of Rights, you look at the 17 amendments that have been adopted since the Bill of Rights, the vast majority of them are suffrage enlarging, democracy perfecting amendments. Right? So the 15th Amendment said no discrimination in voting based on race. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of U.S. senators from legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. The 23rd Amendment gave people in Washington, D.C. at least the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment got rid of poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So almost all of the amendments have been about building a more perfect union, not a more perfect corporation. That's what they've been about. And so the movement that this magnificent new organization is assisting this weekend is a movement that is in the mainstream of our constitutional history. It's about building the more perfect union and creating more democracy. We started as a slave republic of Christian white male property owners. Our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, talked about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he knew that that was a dream. That's the glorious vision of America. But we have steadily opened up that slave republic over time to African Americans, to women, to people who were without property and without wealth, people who had been excluded from the political community. But I'll close just with this one image that I love from Lincoln, where he, in defending what the Union was doing in the Civil War, said that the Constitution is like the silver platter and holding an apple, and the apple is liberty and freedom. And I think we can borrow the image to say, today, the apple is democracy and the silver platter is elections. But You can have the silver platter without having the apple. If the democracy is gobbled up and eaten up by large corporations who get to control everything that happens both in our politics and our government, we can have the form of democracy with the silver platter, but the apple is gone. And so the purpose of this conference is to save the apple, democracy itself.
Let me follow up on something that Jamie said, and I think this is important. Keep in mind, and I suspect that most of you have constitutions, and by the time you leave here, you will have a constitution. But keep in mind, you can search that constitution in the federal constitution, you will never find the word corporation in it. Not once. Not once. Now, corporations, non-human entities, have certain rights, constitutional rights. Not all the rights that we enjoy yet, but they have constitutional rights. You know where those constitutional rights came from? Not from the language of the Constitution, not from the framers' intent in framing the language of the Constitution. Every one of the rights, constitutional rights, that corporations and special interests and all these people enjoy, these non-human people, every one of those was created by the Supreme Court of the United States from whole cloth. Every single one of them. So what's next? We have a corporation, we have a presidential election coming up that God knows where that's going to wind up. But if it goes the wrong way and the wrong people get on the Supreme Court, maybe what's next, we're going to give corporations the right to vote based on their wealth. Why not? They enjoy other constitutional rights. Why not the right to vote? And then your vote, your one vote, really will be meaningless. So I think that where this is all going, and what gives me hope, is the fact that I think the American people are starting, maybe especially with an election cycle, to see what the effect of money is. There will be billions spent in this presidential election campaign. Billions with a B. And you know where all that money's coming from? From less than 1% of the American people. For less than 1%. So big money is controlling our elections. And if we, the people, don't want to rise to the challenge and to take our Constitution back, it belongs to us. It belongs to us as voters, as human beings, as Americans. And unless we're willing to stand up and take it back, then we're going to give it away to corporations and special interests. And I don't think the American people are willing to do that. We send people into battle in foreign wars, and we say they're fighting for our freedom and way of life. Well, if each of us wants to fight for our freedom and way of life, we need to pass the 28th Amendment.
So I have two excellent questions here, and I'm going to read them both because they're pretty closely related. And I would recommend, I don't know how much time we have left, probably not a whole lot, but if anyone else has questions, you should get to them soon. And I can't read that at all because the lights are really bright up here, so you have to tell me how much time we have.
We're about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. So these are the questions. Isn't it a mistake to focus only on Citizens United and the rights of corporations, since Buckley v. Vallejo made money into speech? Isn't this about money and politics from any source that controls government? And the next one, as I said, they're related. I'm concerned that a 28th Amendment that allows congressional regulation of campaign finance will not fix the problem. The influence of big money did not start with Citizens United, it just got worse. So I open that up to all of you, because I think these are two very, very strong questions.
Let me deal with the first one. The question is correct. There is more than Citizens United. Citizens United is the big nut, but Buckley is a problem too. In fact, as a member of the United States Congress, I introduced a constitutional amendment to change Buckley. I will tell you, it was not given a hearing. But You also have McCutcheon, and you have other rulings that are consistent. And once the court has made these decisions, in one sense, it's consistent in its logic. But consistent logic is not necessarily compelling logic. And I personally believe the court has gone down a track that it's very difficult to change. And that's, again, another reason why you have the need for a constitutional amendment. But let me explain what I mean. Democracy is obviously not a great protection against making no mistakes, but it's probably the best system to change mistakes. But the great balancing institution in America is the Supreme Court. And a philosopher named John Locke, who was a philosophical godfather of Jefferson, once said, "Nothing was more dangerous than a good prince." And what we have here, in my judgment, is the most venerated institution of governance in a legal way, perhaps in the history of the world, has made a mistake. And in making a mistake, it is really hard to change. And part of it, again, goes back to human nature. It is really hard for people to say, maybe I erred or we erred. But it has to happen if we're going to save our democracy. Now, I think it has become so increasingly, and it's the strongest word that one can use in the American political vocabulary, it is self-evident that it has to change. I think that is why there is grounds for a constitutional amendment gathering momentum. And Jamie's mentioned that statistically a lot of people don't approve Citizens United, but it's very interesting. The one thing that is totally common between the supporters of Bernie Sanders, many of the supporters of Donald Trump, many of the Tea Party Republicans, is a firm belief that inside people have too much influence in Washington. And I think you can get support from very Republican states for a constitutional amendment, and you can get support from very Democratic states for a constitutional amendment, and we err grievously not to press it.
If I could add to it, Caroline, first of all, we're doing a panel tomorrow morning, which I think I'm moderating about just this question, but it's clear to me the first questioner is right, that we've got multiple problems on the table, not just one problem. One issue, the one we've been focused on, is we need to rebuild a wall of separation between corporate treasury wealth and public elections. And you can view it like the wall of separation between church and state. And both of these distinguished panelists have pointed out that our whole constitutional design was set up to chop power up, because our founders understood that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. James Madison said the very definition of tyranny is the collapse of all powers into one, which is kind of where we're headed in terms of economic and political power. So that's very high on the agenda, to rebuild that wall of separation. But there's other things that the Supreme Court has done along in the same vein. There's that terrible Arizona Free Enterprise Club PAC decision, which amazingly said that if you create a public financing regime, and that's allowable within the Buckley framework, if you create it, you cannot even up the score as much as possible by giving more money to publicly financed candidates to catch up even halfway to wealthy privately financed candidates. Believe it or not, a majority in the Supreme Court said that under the First Amendment, that violates the free speech rights of the wealthy candidate, which not only has the right to spend all the money that they want, but they have a right to freeze the political inequality. In essence, it becomes a chilling of their speech to allow public financing to go in. So we got to clear that up. And then there was the original decision in Buckley, which made it impossible to impose limits on expenditures. Now, that's a really complicated one. I think that's a genuine problem. It wouldn't be so much of a problem if we lived in a society where people had relatively equal wealth and income. People could spend what they want, and some people who are more passionate about electoral politics might spend somewhat more than others, but not really that much more. The problem is that we're living in a society of extraordinary economic extremes, So if you say that individual human beings can spend whatever they want, forget corporations for a second, you can get people who are putting tens of millions of dollars in to the $50 someone else can put in, and then you get the kind of 1,000-to-1 ratio under that. So you could try to reverse that by restoring the power of Congress simply to regulate expenditures and contributions. You get into the problem, which has been articulated ever since Buckley was decided, that, well, does that mean that those people can't now go outside of the electoral sphere specifically and spend their money on just, publishing books and newspaper articles and speech and so on? And I think that that is a real problem, because I consider myself a First Amendment zealot and a free speech zealot. And the only real solution ultimately to that problem, because we don't want to go around censoring people's ability to speak even outside of the campaign context, the only real problem is to create a lot more economic equality in America so everybody's voice is roughly equal in the political sphere. But I do think that there's going to be different proposals to address lots of these different problems that are out there.
Justice Nelson, you want to speak to those?
Well, just very briefly, and I agree with Jamie. I think that the language that the 28th Amendment ultimately will take is a work in progress. I think that we are going to have to address a number of these problems that are on the table. I think one thing we should do is just get away from the idea that non-human entities have constitutional rights. And I'm not, I'm saying that, I'm not against corporations. Corporations are a very important business facility, non-human entity that's necessary to our economy and our global economy. The corporations can have powers. They don't need to have rights, and that's what they've got now. And it's these rights of free speech and the rights that they have that I think is a problem. So that, I think we could take the idea of corporations having rights off the table too if we worked out.
Can I add one thing to that, Carol? Just to say, when I was running for office, and I've written a lot about this, people would say, well, is that an anti-corporate view to say you're opposed to Citizens United? I said, not at all. I mean, I represent tons of people who work for corporations, and I've worked for corporations. I want corporations to research and develop and thrive and prosper and do what corporations do, but I don't want them to govern, and that's the difference.
Right. Well, let's give a big round of applause for the Thank you.